68 years ago, a 17-year-old girl vanished without a trace on the road leading into the Mark Twain National Forest, leaving her family shattered and the entire town of Hannibal gripped by fear. Authorities suspected a young man driving a dark-colored pickup truck, who had also been seen the very night she disappeared, was involved, but with no body recovered and far too little evidence to pursue, the investigation eventually stalled. Yet through all those years, Evelyn's desperate mother never gave up hope, clinging to the faintest chance that her daughter was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. Then one day, when an old house was being demolished, workers uncovered a single overlooked detail, one that could upend the entire case and shock everyone involved in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. It was late summer 1957, and Hannibal, Missouri, lay under a thin veil of fog that clung to the wooden rooftops lining the Mississippi River, giving the small town the appearance of holding its breath. The cobblestone streets of the old downtown were nearly deserted at dusk, lit only by the faint yellow glow spilling from a few late-opened shops. It was in that heavy, suspended atmosphere that 17-year-old Evelyn Brooks was last seen. A passerby later recalled that she left the downtown area, looking panicked after a heated argument they'd overheard snippets of. No one knew what the fight was about, but everyone who saw her said Evelyn was walking so fast she was almost running, her thin dress fluttering in the night breeze like a blurred streak of light. On the road that led toward the edge of the Mark Twain National Forest, where the thick black tree line swallowed the last of the daylight, several people described seeing Evelyn walking alone, appearing to avoid anyone's gaze, occasionally glancing back as if something had made her uneasy. It was at that moment, according to a man who lived near that stretch of road, that the headlights of an old pickup truck suddenly appeared behind her. The truck was moving suspiciously slowly, its white-yellow beams sweeping a long path across the pavement and glinting off the trees on both sides. The man said Evelyn hesitated for a split second, but he went back inside before he could see what happened next. After the truck and the girl disappeared into the darkness between the forest and the town, no one in Hannibal ever saw Evelyn again. The next morning, while the sun still hadn't burned off the thick river fog, Evelyn's mother walked into her daughter's room and saw the bed still perfectly made, no sign anyone had slept in it. She called through the house, searched the yard, then went door to door to neighbors, only to be met with confused shakes of the head. For hours, the family scoured nearby streets, asking every acquaintance and shop owner, but no one knew anything beyond the fact that Evelyn had left downtown the night before. When the sun was fully up and anxiety had turned into a slow-burning dread, the Brooks family finally walked into the Marion County Sheriff's Office with the news no one wanted to say out loud: Evelyn Brooks was missing. Sheriff Alan Reeves received the missing person report early that morning, before the first rays of sunlight had fully pierced the heavy fog blanketing Hannibal. The usually quiet Marion County office on a Sunday morning suddenly became frantic when the Brooks family walked in, faces ashen. Reeves, a man far more accustomed to minor disturbances and land disputes than serious disappearances, immediately sensed something different in the trembling voice of Evelyn's mother. He wrote down every detail the family could provide: the last time they saw Evelyn at home, her daily habits, and especially the fact that she'd left downtown after an argument. Reeves asked them to describe exactly what clothes Evelyn was wearing when she left, then immediately phoned 2 deputies on patrol near downtown to begin canvassing. While the family went back out to keep searching around their neighborhood, Reeves walked over to the large wall map, marking the locations mentioned in their statements with a pencil. He then went out to interview the witnesses the family had named, visiting the grocery store, the small riverside church, and the few shops that had still been open the night before. From those separate accounts, he began piecing together Evelyn's final route. She left downtown heading toward Mark Twain Avenue, was seen on the east sidewalk, then continued onto the road leading to the forest's edge. A middle-aged woman sweeping her porch said Evelyn was walking so fast she clearly wanted to get out of the center of town as quickly as possible. A man who lived near downtown said he saw the headlights of a pickup truck appear right behind her, but he couldn't make out the license plate and didn't know whether it was following her or just passing by. Reeves wrote the truck description in capital letters, then placed a red dot at the spot where the witness said the headlights swept across Evelyn. That became the last reliably confirmed last known location. Standing in front of the Old Town map, Reeves drew a wide circle around the area, extending from the edge of the residential zone to the entrance of the Mark Twain Forest, creating the initial search perimeter. The pencil line stood out sharply on the frayed paper map, as if marking a patch of darkness thick with unanswered questions. Reeves called in 2 more officers, instructing them to compile a list of residents living near the forest boundary, and to check everyone within a several-mile radius who owned an older pickup truck. By the time morning turned to noon, he had a temporary picture. Evelyn was last seen in the transitional zone between town and forest, an area remote enough to hide something, yet close enough for passers-by to catch a glimpse. With only the complete disappearance of a 17-year-old girl on a quiet evening to go on, Reeves felt the full weight of the case. He ordered the search teams to prepare and informed the office that they would begin sweeping the area he'd just circled. In his mind there was only one question: which part of that circle had Evelyn vanished into? The initial search began that same afternoon. Sheriff Alan Reeves mobilized every available deputy from the Marion County office, called in a handful of volunteers from the neighborhood near the Brooks home, and split everyone into small teams of 2 or 3. They walked slowly along the cobblestone streets around downtown, where wooden houses stood shoulder to shoulder, and low front porches looked out onto roads that were normally busy with tourists, but were now shrouded in tense silence. The teams moved methodically from one end of the street to the other, checking under porches, small bushes, gaps between old sheds, calling Evelyn's name in low, cautious voices, as if afraid to disturb the thick air of unease. Some residents stood in their yards, hands braced against doorframes, watching the searchers pass with looks of confusion mixed with worry, offering scattered bits of information about whether they'd seen Evelyn the night before or heard anything unusual, but everything was vague, nothing solid enough to become a real lead. Reeves authorized the use of the county's 2 aging bloodhounds, given a thin blouse of Evelyn's found in her closet. At first the dogs led a team down the main street, turned at 2 intersections, then circled back near the Brooks neighborhood, as if picking up a faint trace, but after several loops around the residential area, they slowed and lost the scent, forcing Reeves to move the teams closer to the edge of town, where other smells mixed in and the wind blowing from the forest made the trail harder to follow. The searchers pushed a little wider, checking every yard and strip of grass along fences, but still found nothing that could be linked to Evelyn. No item of clothing, no sign she had even passed that point after leaving downtown. As the afternoon faded and the sunlight turned dull gray, stretching long across the pavement, the searchers' steps grew heavier, and everyone began to realize the search had produced no real results. Reeves logged every area covered, marking on the map the routes walked and the spots where the dogs had lingered longer than usual, even though he couldn't say whether that meant anything or was just a tired dog's natural reaction. As darkness fell, the sheriff called everyone back to the temporary staging point before night fully enveloped the neighborhood, to avoid searchers getting separated or contaminating possible evidence. He looked at the small streets disappearing into the dark, wondering where Evelyn had gone after leaving this area, and how a 17-year-old girl could vanish without leaving behind even the smallest item or sign she had stopped anywhere. No physical evidence, no signs of a struggle, no one heard a scream, nothing to follow except vague accounts of a small figure hurrying through the night. When the first day's search ended, Reeves knew it was only the beginning, that the search area would have to expand beyond Hannibal's familiar streets, farther into the shadows along the road to the Mark Twain Forest that still waited. The next morning, after the initial search results were compiled into wide blank zones on the map, Sheriff Alan Reeves moved to the next phase, expanding the list of witnesses who had been on the road the night Evelyn disappeared. He and a deputy returned to downtown, knocking on every shop, diner, and home along the route where yellow streetlights fell on cobblestone. The people who had been out that night were tracked down one by one, each providing a small piece of the chaotic evening the Brooks family still couldn't comprehend. A young couple said they saw Evelyn hurrying toward the edge of the Mark Twain Forest, her small figure swallowed by the darkness just past a curve. They heard no scream or loud noise, but her urgency stood out. Another witness, the man whose house sat on the narrow stretch leading into the forest, remembered the blinding headlights of an old pickup truck moving behind the girl. According to him, the truck wasn't speeding, it was creeping along almost matching Evelyn's pace, but the lights were too bright and he was too far away to see the driver clearly. Several others also mentioned the truck, describing it as dark-colored, with an old rumbling engine and headlights that shone low onto the road. These consistent details began forming the thread. Reeves was trying to follow. Evelyn left downtown along the small road that skirted the edge of town, and shortly afterward, an old dark pickup appeared behind her. Whether by coincidence or intent still unknown. Reeves wrote every statement in his notebook and added private symbols to the wall map. The 3 locations where witnesses saw Evelyn all lay along a single stretch running from the center of town out to the entrance of the Mark Twain Forest, creating a clearer path than he'd had on the first day. With a ruler he connected the 3 points into a line, then widened it on both sides to form a plausible corridor of movement. Most witnesses agreed Evelyn seemed to be avoiding something. Some even said she looked back several times as if afraid she was being followed. Reeves calculated the distance between sightings and the times people remembered, estimating her walking speed in those final minutes. Together, it gave him a more complete picture of that night, though still riddled with gaps. One detail that particularly caught his attention was the stretch between the last confirmed sighting and the forest edge. A segment that took only a few minutes to walk, but had no houses or shops, meaning if anything happened there, very few people could have seen it. He marked that zone in red, labeling it the route's blind spot. Finally, after cross-checking every statement and re-examining the map, Reeves finalized Evelyn's last known path, leaving downtown, walking alone toward the forest, followed by an old dark pickup truck, and vanishing on the dark stretch just before the tree line. No physical evidence surfaced during the interviews, but the consistent accounts from multiple witnesses convinced Reeves that her heading toward the Mark Twain Forest wasn't speculation. It was a real trajectory. When he set down his pencil and stepped back to take in the whole map, his expression darkened. The route was too narrow, too dark, too isolated. If Evelyn had truly walked into that void, whatever happened on that final few hundred yards remained the thing that filled Reeves with a growing sense of dread he couldn't shake. From the consistent witness statements about the old pickup truck that appeared right behind Evelyn the night she vanished, Sheriff Alan Reeves decided to shift the investigation toward the suspect vehicle because in a small town like Hannibal in 1957, there simply couldn't be that many trucks matching the description. That afternoon, he returned to the office, pulled out the thick Marion County vehicle registration files, handwritten and typed pages mixed together, organized by year and owner. Reeves dragged a chair over, sat down in front of the stack, and began combing through the list of vehicles that could match the witnesses' descriptions. Dark-colored pickup, headlights a bit low, engine making an uneven rumble, a small but repeatedly mentioned detail. He first filtered for the most common models in the county at the time, mainly Ford F-Series and Chevrolet Task Force trucks, the kind most farmers and tradesmen drove. Based on the low headlight description, Reeves eliminated newer models and focused on older, more beat-up ones typically found on farms. After more than an hour of sorting, he narrowed it down to 18 dark-colored pickups registered in the county, model years 1948, 1955. The range that best fit witness accounts. But not all were suspicious. Reeves used the county map to mark where each owner lived and checked the distance from their homes to the road Evelyn had walked. Anyone who lived too far away or had no reason to be near the forest boundary that night was moved off the priority list. From 18 trucks, he was down to 9 owners needing closer scrutiny. Reeves continued narrowing by occupation and regular travel patterns, using tax records, trade licenses, or information from the town office. Some owners worked night shifts at the docks or lumber mills and had solid alibis. Others were long-haul drivers out of state the weekend. Evelyn disappeared. After eliminating those with reasonable explanations, 4 names remain. One of them made Reeves pause longer with his pen: Donald Kerrigan, 25 years old, a carpenter who lived on the east side of Hannibal, just a few miles from downtown. Donald owned a black 1953-ish Ford F-Series that had a repair shop note about slightly misaligned headlights, a detail that matched descriptions of light shining low onto the dark road. Reeves didn't jump to conclusions. He kept checking Donald's work history. Notes showed the man often drove through areas with forest access to pick up lumber or headed early to job sites deep in the woods. What concerned Reeves most, though, was that Donald lived alone. No one could definitively confirm where he was that night. Still, Reeves stuck to basic investigative principle: no one became a suspect without clear evidence. So Donald wasn't interviewed immediately. He was simply added to the verification list along with the other 3 owners, following proper procedure. Reeves wrote the name under needs verification, clipped the file shut, and set it beside the map now covered in pencil marks. He stepped back a little, studying the lines connecting witness sightings to each owner's residence, trying to picture who might have been in exactly the right place at the right time that night without drawing attention. Outside the window, the first autumn leaves were drifting down into the yard. The distant sound of horse-drawn wagons made the town feel even quieter. Reeves knew the dark pickup could be the most crucial link right now, simply because it was the only detail that appeared consistently across multiple accounts. An overlap too significant to ignore in a case almost completely lacking physical evidence. Yet nothing directly tied any of the 4 trucks to Evelyn that night, and nothing proved any of the owners had even come into contact with her. With a short list of 4 names in front of him, Reeves ended another long day, knowing the next steps would require expanding the investigation farther from town, closer to where the street lights no longer reached, deeper toward the Mark Twain Forest, where Evelyn had last been seen before she vanished, as if she had never existed at all. The morning after, when the map in Sheriff Alan Reeves's office was now covered with additional search zone lines and red markings indicating areas that needed further expansion, he decided to launch the next phase of the search, sending the team deeper into the borderlands of Mark Twain Forest, the place every final witness statement pointed toward. The road leading into the forest was narrow, its surface nothing more than compacted dirt blanketed with dry leaves, flanked by ancient oaks that formed a natural canopy, so thick even daylight struggled to filter through completely. The 6-man search team split into 2 groups, carrying maps, whistles, and an old short-range radio for communication. They began moving inward from the roadside, stepping carefully so as not to disturb any trace that might still remain from the night Evelyn vanished. The air inside the forest was dense and damp. The smell of earth rose up like a thin film on the skin, making every sound feel heavier. Beneath their feet lay a thick carpet of rotting leaves that could easily conceal anything that had fallen. Reeves led the front group, eyes scanning every shadow between the trunks, noting anything unusual: a broken branch, a patch of disturbed leaves, or faint tire tracks blurred by the rainstorm 2 days earlier that had eroded parts of the ground. About an hour in, a team member behind him called out quietly but firmly. Reeves turned and saw the man pointing to a spot right at the base of a large oak, where a sliver of light broke through the canopy. On the layer of dry leaves lay something with an unnatural color against the dull brown. Reeves crouched, carefully picking it up with 2 fingertips. It was a piece of caramel-colored wig hair, a section of synthetic strands torn off, curled at the edge, and clinging to a bit of damp soil. He immediately placed it on a clean cloth, signaled the group to step back so no one would trample the surrounding area, then began expanding the search radius, using wooden stakes to mark a small circle around the evidence site. As they continued combing the ground, another member bent down and picked up a small scrap of pale blue fabric, snagged on a low dry branch at ankle height. The cloth was torn, its edges frayed, as if it had been ripped by catching on something as someone hurried past. Reeves measured the scrap with a wooden ruler, noted the details in his notebook, exact location, depth into the forest from the road, and distance from the wig piece. Then, following 1957 investigative protocol, sketched a miniature crime scene diagram right there on the spot, numbering each point with brief descriptions so the precise layout could be reconstructed back at the office. These tiny pieces of evidence carried special weight in a disappearance that had left absolutely no trace. They were scattered fragments of some movement that had taken place in the darkness that night. Reeves sent the second group north in a wide arc to look for more ground disturbance or discarded items, but the forest seemed to have swallowed everything else. Beyond those two small finds, there were no clear signs, no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest a struggle or impact. The heavy rain 2 days earlier might have softened the ground enough to erase traces. Standing in the dim clearing, Reeves looked at the two items now in clean cloth bags and felt one thing very clearly. Evelyn had been here, or been brought here, moving fast enough to tear her clothing and lose part of her wig. Near the roadside, he noticed a slight disturbance in the leaves and a shallow depression that could have been an old tire mark, but it wasn't deep or distinct enough to confirm or include in the report as solid evidence. Still, these small details were the first links connecting Evelyn's final known route to the edge of the forest. As the team moved another few dozen yards in, Reeves slowly marked their path, pausing after every discovery to jot notes. When the sweep ended, he stood quietly staring into the endless depths ahead where tree shadows fell in dark patches. The two meager finds, a scrap of wig and a piece of fabric, couldn't say how far Evelyn had gone or what had really happened, but they were enough for the case's first firm conclusion. The 17-year-old girl had been inside Mark Twain Forest the night she disappeared. And if she hadn't walked in on her own, someone had taken her there. Sheriff Alan Reeves returned to the office late that afternoon with the first two pieces of evidence, carefully sealed, and a map covered in pencil marks. He set the small cloth bags containing the wig scrap and fabric piece on his desk, then reopened the witness interview notes, trying to string everything he had into a logical sequence. The wig piece had been found several dozen yards inside the tree line, exactly in the direction multiple witnesses said they saw Evelyn heading, or at least being pushed, pulled, or led that way. The fact that the wig section had come loose couldn't be coincidence. The torn root showed it had been yanked hard or jerked sideways while the wearer was moving out of control. Reeves noted this observation in his book, keeping emotion out and sticking strictly to what the evidence showed. The pale blue fabric scrap found nearby, snagged on a low dry branch close to the ground, reinforced the likelihood that Evelyn had caught on something while moving quickly. Witnesses all described her walking very fast, but no one saw her running. That raised the question, had Evelyn walked into the woods in a panic after the argument, or had someone been with her? Reeves went back to the page describing the old pickup truck, a detail mentioned independently by 3 witnesses. The man who lived near the forest said the headlights were low and yellowish, shining far down the road. The woman sweeping her porch remembered hearing an old engine rumbling from behind. If the truck appeared just minutes before Evelyn was last seen at the forest turnoff, the odds were high that the two events were connected. Reeves marked the spot where the witness heard the truck and drew a pencil line to the wig piece location. The distances lined up with the speed of a truck moving slowly or stopping intermittently while following someone on foot. If Evelyn had been forced into the truck, the evidence would have been closer to the road, not this deep in yet. The wig piece was fairly deep, meaning she had walked on her own legs at some point. That pushed Reeves toward the theory of a struggle or an attempt to escape something. He reviewed the fabric scrap's position, several yards farther in from the wig piece, forming a slanted path inward like a trail of bits torn from the victim while running or being dragged. Reeves wrote a short analysis. High probability victim changed direction suddenly, avoiding obstacle or escaping someone closing in. But she could also have tripped over a root in the dark. With no body to determine injuries or direction of flight, every hypothesis rested on two tiny scraps. He returned to the witness who said Evelyn kept looking back as she neared the forest edge. If that wariness continued deeper in, the wig coming loose made even more sense. She might have yanked it in panic, or it was pulled when someone grabbed her shoulder or clothing. Reeves built a temporary timeline. Evelyn leaves the old neighborhood in an upset state, heads toward the forest. The pickup appears behind her. She reaches the tree line, possibly hearing the truck or a stranger. Then either she's forced deeper in or chooses the woods to escape whoever was behind her. Reeves' jaw clenched as he added a line. No shoe prints, no clear tire tracks, no drag marks sufficient to confirm struggle. Exactly, everything existed only as suggestion, not evidence. The spongy ground under thick leaves meant any footprints would have been erased by the heavy rain. He reviewed the entire route from the old neighborhood to the evidence sites. According to witnesses, Evelyn's walk should have taken only minutes, but the truck's appearance suggested events could have unfolded faster and more violently. Still, Reeves couldn't put that in a report as fact without a direct witness. He circled the wig location on the map as point A, the fabric as point B, a few yards apart. When he connected the dots, the path felt broken, discontinuous, unlike Evelyn's normal stride when she left town. Something had happened between those 2 points that left no strong trace. Reeves set his pen down and stared at the 2 small evidence bags. The wig scrap and fabric proved Evelyn had been in the forest, but couldn't answer the bigger question, what happened to her after that moment? No body, no weapon, no clear signs of attack, abduction or accident. Reeves was stuck between what the evidence hinted at and what he needed to reach a conclusion. The timeline he'd built lasted only minutes before being swallowed by the forest darkness, not enough to identify a stalker, harmful act, or cause of disappearance. No matter how he pieced the details together, a huge gap remained right in the middle of the story. From the moment Evelyn left the main road to the moment the evidence fell, every possibility was open, but none had concrete proof. Reeves closed the investigation notebook, feeling the bottleneck tightening around the case. These 2 scraps, though significant in scope, still weren't enough for any legally meaningful next step. And so the timeline he had labored over remained incomplete, missing the link between what human eyes had seen and what the forest darkness had kept. With the evidence from Mark Twain Forest still too weak to open any clear new leads, Sheriff Alan Reeves had to shift the investigation from the scene to Evelyn's personal life, hoping to find some connection between her and the dark-colored pickup mentioned in multiple statements. He returned to the old neighborhood and tracked down the group of friends Evelyn had been spending time with in recent months, people who knew how her mood changed after leaving home at night. One of them, a girl named Marlene, roughly Evelyn's age but more mature, hesitated when Reeves asked about her friend's recent relationships. After a long silence, she admitted Evelyn sometimes disappeared in the evenings to meet someone she knew, but never said who. When Reeves pressed, Marlene revealed that about 2 weeks before Evelyn went missing, she had seen her climb down from a dark pickup parked near the East Hill in town. The driver was a man in his mid-20s or older, slim build, face unclear in the dusk, but definitely much older than Evelyn. Reeves set his pen down, feeling a small wave ripple through his thoughts. This matched descriptions he had collected from the suspect vehicle list and moved the truck's owner, Donald Kerrigan, higher on the board. Still, Reeves stuck to his rule. A vague connection couldn't become the focus without real evidence. He kept questioning the friends about Evelyn's recent strange behavior. Another said Evelyn once came home looking crushed after meeting that man, refusing to answer questions. At other times, she suddenly seemed happy, as if someone had made her a promise or given her special attention. Though none could name the man, the accounts gave Reeves a clearer pattern. Evelyn had an ongoing relationship with an older man who showed up at night, usually in a pickup, and seemed to make her increasingly uneasy. Reeves cross-checked the files on the 3 remaining truck owners on the list. One was a farmer with a big family, one a night shift mill worker, the last a long-haul driver almost never in town on weeknights. Their schedules made it hard for any of them to be present at the exact time and place Evelyn was last seen. Only Donald Kerrigan fit the vehicle, age range and availability in the area at night. Reeves added a note to the file, probable contact between Evelyn and Kerrigan, yes. Yet everything he had was second-hand stories and coincidental matches between witness descriptions and vehicle records. No one had directly seen Evelyn get into Donald's truck or talk to him that night. The wig scrap and fabric from the woods couldn't be tied to anyone, much less point to Donald as the last person with her. Though the pieces were starting to form the hazy outline of a suspicious connection, Reeves knew calling Donald in now would be premature and could backfire, putting him on guard if he was involved. With evidence this thin, a direct interview might deadlock the investigation faster. He left Donald in the potential suspect column, with a red star but no summon mark. A sense of helplessness crept in as Reeves closed Evelyn's relationship file. He had signs of unusual behavior, an older man who matched the truck description, but nothing crossed the line from speculation. The pieces weren't big enough to name a perpetrator, yet sharp enough that he couldn't ignore them, like shadows lurking at the edge of Mark Twain Forest, hinting at a truth very close yet still out of reach. With the investigation in town and Mark Twain Forest yielding no clear progress, Sheriff Alan Reeves had to expand the search in another direction. The banks of the Mississippi River, only a few miles from where Evelyn was last seen, and always a complicated terrain capable of hiding anything under thick mud, tangled reeds, and silently flowing water. Early the next morning, Reeves assembled a team of 3 deputy sheriffs, several local volunteers familiar with the riverbank, and 2 men with motorboats to sweep along the water's edge. The air by the river was heavy with the smell of mud mixed with a salty river breeze, and a white mist hovered over the surface like a curtain that limited visibility. The small motorboats cut through the water along shallow branches where reeds grew in dense, interwoven clumps like nets, while the shore team followed patches of eroded soil or unusually flattened grass, small signs that sometimes proved crucial in missing persons cases. Reeves walked ahead of the riverbank group, eyes scanning every gap between tall grass, occasionally crouching to examine patches of brown earth, pushed aside as if something heavy had slid down. Out on the water, the boat operators gently probed reed clusters and shallow mud with long poles to check for anything caught beneath the soft silt. The Mississippi was vast, but the shallow banks near Hannibal held many small drop-offs, each capable of holding whatever fell in. Everyone moved slowly and patiently. One careless step could destroy evidence or let the current carry it away. After a while, as the shore team followed a bend in the river, a deputy spotted something small tangled at the base of a reed stalk. Reeves walked over, bent down, and carefully pulled it free. It was a thin piece of black electrical wire, one end slightly frayed, the outer plastic scratched in places as if it had been rubbed hard. He laid it across his palm, turning it to check for burns or cuts, but aside from clinging dirt there was nothing special. Still, its presence within the search area made him log it carefully. Thin, electrical wire, found riverbank, relation unknown. He wrapped it in clean cloth, sealed it, and marked the spot on the map with a small circle. The team paused to sweep the surrounding area, but nothing else turned up. No clothing, no shoes, no personal items, no drag marks, and most importantly, no body. That left Reeves with a heavy emptiness. A 17-year-old girl couldn't simply vanish into thin air, yet every path the police had followed left only a few tiny scraps that told him nothing concrete about what had really happened. He looked back at the rocky, uneven riverbank, water lapping at the shallows in small ripples, hearing the distant thud of wood against boat hulls. This should have been a place where something would turn up if tragedy had occurred near the water, yet the shallow bank was completely empty, no disturbance proving anyone had been pushed in or pulled out. On the boats, the operators made a few more passes, dragging long hooks through larger reed patches, but brought up only mud, weeds, and rotten branches. No strange sounds, no heavy submerged object caught in the shallows. It all only deepened the inexplicable void of Evelyn's disappearance. As the sun climbed higher and the mist thinned, revealing water shimmering silver under the light, Reeves signaled the end of the morning search. He stood quietly on the bank for a moment, looking at the electrical wire in its clean cloth bag, wondering whether it had anything to do with what happened the night Evelyn vanished, or was just random debris that had floated in. But whether it belonged to her or not, the absence of a body put the case in a severely disadvantaged state. A missing persons case without a body meant lacking the single most important piece of evidence to explain what occurred, making every theory, no matter how reasonable, hard to substantiate. Reeves wrote in the report, "No body evidence." From those dry words, he clearly felt the case sliding away from visible trails and into the gray zone of unprovable hypotheses with no tangible traces left to check. When the search along the Mississippi River ended without yielding any verifiable trace, Sheriff Alan Reeves returned to his office in the exhaustion of a man who had pushed every ounce of his professional skill into places that should have held answers. He spread out all the evidence collected over the days of searching on the desk: a piece of wig hair, a pale blue fabric thread, a thin piece of electrical wire, arranging them in chronological order and by discovery location. Then reviewing each item as the late afternoon light stretched the shadows of the small objects, long and slanted across the wooden tabletop. Each piece of evidence could suggest something, but none could be directly linked to any specific individual. The wig piece might have belonged to Evelyn, but it carried no identifying marks. The pale blue fabric did not match the description of her clothing from witness accounts. The piece of electrical wire found by the river was far too common. An item that could belong to anyone in town, from car owners to electricians to people dumping trash near the bank. Though Reeves wanted to treat it as a lead, he was forced to admit that no connection was strong enough to be included in the report as guiding evidence. While he was re-examining the witness statements, another problem made the situation worse. Consistency in the testimonies began to crumble. A woman who had firmly claimed to see Evelyn walking toward the Mark Twain Forest now said she wasn't sure the girl was Evelyn because it was too dark. The man who described the headlights of a pickup truck said it could have been lights from another vehicle on the main road, no longer certain the truck was following Evelyn. Another witness who had described Evelyn's walking speed said he had only caught a glimpse and didn't clearly remember whether she was alone or someone was behind her. This retraction of statements made Reeves realize that the few puzzle pieces he had were continuing to fall away, leaving him with a chain of stories growing ever fainter under the pressure of time and the invisible fear of the townspeople, the fear of being dragged into a case whose seriousness no one could gauge. He reopened the list of potential suspects, where the name Donald Kerrigan was marked in red with the note "possible contact with victim," but Reeves knew full well that suspicion alone was not grounds to summon a man living an ordinary life, with no prior record and no direct accuser. No one had seen Donald with Evelyn, no physical evidence had fallen from his truck, and no resident claimed to have seen his Ford F-Series at the scene. Under the legal constraints of 1957, Reeves had no authority to bring Kerrigan in for questioning based solely on overlapping age and vehicle type. He knew that if he called Donald in now without concrete evidence, the man would become wary. Word could spread through the community, and the case would only grow harder if a real criminal was hiding behind it. Those thoughts left Reeves feeling trapped inside a box where every exit led straight into a wall. After more than 2 weeks of continuous investigation, not a single step forward had escaped the initial zone of suspicion, and no new clue had emerged. The evidence was not strong enough. The statements had become vague, and the predicted route, though logical, lacked confirmation. Reeves read and reread the file, always pausing at the biggest blank: no body. No body meant no endpoint from which to reconstruct events. No way to determine the cause of disappearance. No ability to know whether Evelyn had been attacked, abducted, or met with an accident. Every hypothesis remained mere speculation, and no clue was solid enough to verify. Therefore, in early 1958, after many months without a single trace or statement capable of reopening an investigative direction, Evelyn Brooks's missing person file was presented at the final internal meeting in the sheriff's office. In the small meeting room were only Sheriff Alan Reeves and the two deputies who had stuck with the case from the beginning. No one spoke much. Everything that needed saying had already been exhausted through dozens of reviews, screenings, cross-checks, hopes, and disappointments. Reeves stood beside the faded map board covered with pencil marks written, erased, corrected, and crossed out, a web of possibilities that never reached a conclusion. He read his final notes once more, then signed the line no law enforcement officer ever wants to write: unable to resolve, insufficient evidence. With that signature, Evelyn's case was officially classified as stalled, a status Reeves knew meant hope of uncovering the truth was virtually nil at the present time. Immediately after the meeting, he ordered the clerk to seal all the evidence. The caramel-colored wig piece was placed in an evidence bag, the pale blue fabric preserved in a stiff paper envelope, the riverbank electrical wire wrapped in fresh cloth to replace the moldy one. Everything was neatly packed into a small wooden box labeled according to Marion County standards, Missing Person, Evelyn Brooks, 1957. The box was carefully closed with a low thud like a suppressed sigh, then moved to the storage room in the basement of the county administration building. In the cold, dark space where unsolved cases rested silently on shelves reaching the ceiling, Evelyn's box was placed between two other long-closed files. The heavy steel door shut, and the turning of the lock echoed down the hallway, declaring the official silence of a case no one believed was truly over. The town of Hannibal, after the initial weeks of uproar, gradually returned to daily life. People still remembered Evelyn, but stories about her grew sparse and faded like morning mist dissolving on the Mississippi. Children who grew up only heard the tale in scattered whispers. Adults fell silent whenever the Mark Twain Forest was mentioned at night. The Brooks family was forced to live with a void that would never be filled, though they still believed the truth lay hidden somewhere in those woods. For Reeves, the final mark in the file was not a period but a lingering smudge that haunted him for years afterward. Yet procedure was procedure, and the complete absence of tangible evidence pushed Evelyn's case into the same fate as many other 1950s files. A true cold case. From 1958 onward, Evelyn Brooks's missing person file lay motionless in the Marion County basement archive, quietly enduring thick frost winters and the humid Midwest summers. Each new sheriff inherited the list of unsolved cases, but Evelyn's file was glanced at only a few times before being returned to its spot because no new investigative avenue existed. The ink on the reports faded to light brown, Sheriff Alan Reeves's handwriting became speckled with age spots, and some pages dried and curled at the edges, ready to crumble at a touch. The sealed evidence, the wig piece, the pale blue fabric, the electrical wire, had lost their original colors, but remained inside the wooden box like silent witnesses to a night of mystery. Meanwhile, the witnesses who had spoken to Reeves in 1957 gradually disappeared over time. Some families moved away for better opportunities as Hannibal entered economic hardship. Others died of old age or forgot what they had seen that night, as memory was swallowed by the years. Statements that were already vague became useless because no one remembered details, and some were no longer sure they had seen Evelyn at all or had only heard the story secondhand. Layers of memory dust settled over the case, sinking it into a depth difficult to reach. For a small town, enough time can erase even what seemed unforgettable. Evelyn Brooks's name slowly became a story mentioned in passing on a few porch evenings, then gradually slipped from collective memory. Children born later knew it only through the broken tales of the elderly, and when those elders passed, the story lost its last anchor to everyday life. Even Sheriff Reeves, who had carried heavy regret when closing the file, retired at the end of the 1970s and died not long after, leaving the case in the state he could never fully accept. Against that backdrop of fading memory, Donald Kerrigan quietly left Hannibal in 1962. No one knew the exact reason. Some said he took a new job in Springfield, others that he wanted to leave a town where he'd never fit in, but everyone agreed Donald vanished from Hannibal as quickly as he had arrived. In Springfield, he lived a reserved life without scandal, working as a carpenter in a small shop on the outskirts. His new acquaintances knew nothing of the 1957 disappearance. They only knew him as a quiet man who lived alone and spent most of his time in the garage behind his house, where the steady sound of hammering echoed day after day. No one asked about his past, and he never volunteered it. Time continued to flow, quiet as the Mississippi passing the town, carrying away every trace of a story without an ending. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the Evelyn file was merely a name on an old cold case list among hundreds the county would never solve. No one in current law enforcement mentioned it, and no one in the Hannibal community still saw it as a shared obsession. The disappearance of the 17-year-old girl became a silence stretching more than half a century, a note that slipped from the town's harmony and fell into absolute quiet, waiting for the day someone reopened the cold storage door to wake it. People say time can bury everything, but in the fall of 2010, in the small town of Palmyra, about 20 miles from Hannibal, time accidentally lifted a piece of memory many thought was lost forever. An old wooden house built in the 1940s and vacant for nearly 2 decades was sold to a young family planning to demolish it for a new home. When the work crew arrived, they expected an ordinary day: remove doors, tear down walls, break up the floor. But in old houses, the unexpected always hides in the simplest places. That afternoon, as a worker pried up rotting floorboards in the back room with a crowbar, the tip caught on something hard underneath. Thinking it was a rock, or worse, old plumbing, he bent down, brushed away the sawdust, and revealed a small, dark, square wooden box lying beneath the floor, as if someone had placed it there long before the house was abandoned. The box had no lock, but the lid was stuck tight with dust and cobwebs. Another worker helped gently pry it open, and when light shone through the cracks into the interior, the group fell silent. Inside the box were several items jumbled together: a caramel-colored wig piece, slightly faded at the edges, a small handkerchief embroidered with the initials. In light blue thread, a thin electrical wire coiled into a loop, and a folded yellowed sheet of paper with shaky handwritten words, "I'm sorry." None of the workers knew the value of these objects, but instinct told them what they had found was not ordinary trash. The foreman immediately called local police, and soon the box was transferred to the Marion County Sheriff's Office under proper protocol for evidence of unknown origin. Sheriff Linda Carver, who had been in office 2 years and always took interest in the county's unsolved cases, was present the moment the box entered the temporary examination room. As she opened each item under bright white light, her expression shifted from curiosity to gravity. The caramel wig piece looked strikingly similar to the description in Reeves's old report. The EB handkerchief was almost certainly not coincidence. The thin electrical wire was identical in type to the one found by the river in 1957 and dismissed as worthless. And the "I'm sorry" note made the air in the room thicken as if something heavy had just dropped. Linda pulled the cold case file, so old many pages had to be touched lightly to avoid crumbling. When she opened the evidence section and compared the 1957 descriptions to the items from the Palmyra box, Reeves's handwritten lines seemed to come alive. These were not random discards. They were the missing pieces of a puzzle Reeves could never solve. The wig fragment found in the forest that year was part of a larger piece. The EB handkerchief clearly belonged to Evelyn. The thin wire perfectly matched the type that could be used for strangling or binding, and the apology note, the only personal item, suggested the presence of a hand that knew it had done wrong. Linda checked the address of the old Palmyra house, researched the ownership history, and discovered that one of the previous owners had been an acquaintance of a pickup truck owner whose name appeared on the original 1957 suspect list. Though the link was not yet clear, she was certain of one thing: this box could not be separated from the Evelyn Brooks case. With years of experience as an investigator before becoming sheriff, Linda recognized that the sudden appearance of a box containing exactly the items Reeves had sought but never possessed was the rare turning point in a cold case. The evidence was too obvious, too relevant, too perfectly timed and targeted to be random coincidence. When she set the wooden box down, looked again at its contents, and signed the evidence receipt, Linda Carver knew she had just reopened a door locked for 53 years. And behind that door, Evelyn Brooks's story was still waiting, as if only biding time until the right moment to be pulled back into the light. As soon as the Palmyra box was moved to temporary evidence storage, Sheriff Linda Carver wasted no time. She immediately contacted the forensic lab in Columbia, the most advanced in the region, and requested full analysis of every item inside. The Evelyn Brooks case was too old, the witnesses dead or lost to forgetting, but 2010 science could illuminate what 1957 could not touch. In the first week, technicians began processing the wig piece and the few real hairs still attached deep inside the synthetic fibers. Though decades had degraded most cells, experts isolated several intact mitochondrial DNA segments from the hair roots. mtDNA passed through the maternal line and far more durable than nuclear DNA. When the comparison results arrived at the sheriff's office, Linda sat silently before the report. The mtDNA sequence from the box hairs exactly matched the sample provided by Evelyn's maternal niece, the only living relative in the direct maternal line. This match was not coincidence. It confirmed the hair in the box belonged to Evelyn, merging with the 1957 evidence to form the first conclusive proof in over half a century. From there, Linda turned to the coiled thin electrical wire, once dismissed as river trash when Reeves found it on the Mississippi bank. Forensic experts cut a small section of the outer plastic and examined it under a microscope. At two places near the ends, they found unusual abrasion patterns, the kind caused by strong opposing pulls. One technician described the wire as flattened and deformed, as if it had once been tightened around something soft and cylindrical, a characteristic edge collapse seen in strangulation cases. The repeated wear patterns along the length showed the force was not instantaneous, but sustained for seconds to tens of seconds, consistent with manual use of electrical wire to apply constricting pressure. Notably, the wire in the box shared the same core structure as the 1957 river piece, though it could not be proven they were once one continuous length. Still, the matches in construction, wear, and deformation led Linda to a preliminary conclusion. This was very likely the murder weapon. If in 1957 they had found no trace strong enough to prove Evelyn was attacked, in 2010 the wire became the pivotal exhibit capable of reconstructing a violent act that had previously only been guessed at. Meanwhile, the handwritten "I'm sorry" note was submitted for analysis. The ink had faded, the letters slightly shaky, partly from age, partly because the writer may have been emotionally unstable. Handwriting experts began comparing strokes to documents collected from public records, old driver's licenses, job applications, and tax forms of individuals within the original 1957 suspect circle. When Linda received the comparison report, one name stood out: Donald Kerrigan. Samples of Donald's writing from when he was about 20, taken from 1956, 1958, carpentry shop employment records, shared 5 key characteristics with the note: slant angle, the upward flick at the end of the knot, the curve of the says, the capital A, written without serifs, and uneven spacing between letters, as if written in haste. Though not a perfect match, the similarity far exceeded chance. The expert conclusion read, "High probability same author, 70% confidence level." That figure could not convict on its own, but it was the piece needed to return Donald to the center of the investigation. As results poured in, Linda ordered analysis of the pale blue fabric thread, evidence found in the Mark Twain Forest in 1957, but impossible to source at the time. In 2010, using fiber and dye spectroscopy, they identified it as cotton nylon blend dyed blue mist, an extremely common color in 1950s women's clothing. What caught Linda's attention was the distinctive nylon fiber structure produced by a St. Louis manufacturer that supplied the fabric to only 3 regional women's clothing brands, one of which made the pale blue dress Evelyn was last seen wearing days before her disappearance. Result: the fabric not only matched the color, but the exact manufacturing origin. It was a torn piece from Evelyn's clothing. What had been ambiguous evidence in 1957 became direct evidence in 2010. Linda spread the reports across her desk in order: real hair carrying the Brooks maternal met DNA, fabric matching the dress, wire-bearing strangulation marks, handwriting consistent with young Donald Kerrigan's, and most crucially, all of it deliberately collected and buried together in one box beneath a Palmyra house floor. No item could have ended up in that box without an intentional hand gathering and hiding them after Evelyn vanished. And the person with the clearest motive, opportunity, and capability to do so bore only one name: Donald Kerrigan. Linda underlined Kerrigan's name 3 times on the new case jacket. She needed no further confirmation to know the cold wall surrounding the case for 53 years had begun to crack. For the first time in half a century, the evidence no longer spoke in vague stories. It pointed in one direction only, sharp as a blade cutting through the 1957 fog. The man who had appeared right behind Evelyn the night she vanished had finally left his own fingerprints on the past. With the forensic results pouring in one after another, all confirming the direction of the investigation, Sheriff Linda Carver knew the next step was not just analyzing physical evidence, but reconstructing the entire plausible route that Evelyn and the person who took her into the woods had traveled that night in 1957. She contacted the Spatial Analysis Lab at the University of Missouri, which has a GIS unit that assists law enforcement agencies in recreating movement patterns based on terrain, historical map data, and simulations of travel paths under the lighting and weather conditions of specific times. Old topographic maps from the 1950s were digitized. Every layer of terrain, dirt roads, footpaths, gentle slopes, densely wooded areas, was scanned and loaded into a 3-dimensional model. Linda stood watching the large screen in the analysis room as the technician pulled up the contours of Hannibal and the Mark Twain Forest onto the virtual base. An area that had previously existed only in imagination and the fragmented memories of witnesses from decades ago now appeared clearly in digital space with near absolute precision. She entered into the model the 3 points where witnesses had last seen Evelyn, then input the locations where the wig fragment and the piece of fabric had been found. The GIS automatically connected the points along the most likely route for a person walking at night based on elevation, slope, and tree density in 1957. The results showed that Evelyn almost certainly did not turn onto the main road that went deeper into the forest, where moonlight barely reached and the surface was deeply rutted, but instead entered a narrower, lesser-known trail used only by loggers and local hunters. Linda asked the technician to add one more element to the simulation: a 1950s-era pickup truck moving slowly on a dirt road. Based on witness descriptions of an old engine sound and low-aimed headlights, the system incorporated a 1953 Ford F-Series, the exact model Donald Kerrigan had once owned. The simulation result left Linda motionless for several seconds. The pickup could absolutely enter that trail thanks to its narrow width and high ground clearance. Moreover, the slow speed and downward angled headlights created exactly the pool of light described in the statements. That trail did not appear on any civilian maps, so Reeves in 1957 could not have known about it. But Donald, a carpenter who had worked in the forest area, would certainly have known every shortcut, every path only locals dared drive on. Linda asked to rerun the truck's route, this time using the 2 locations where evidence was found in 1957. The system drew a gentle curve from the forest edge inward about 30 meters, then veered right to where the fabric scrap was discovered. This matched eerily with descriptions of the trail. It had a natural bend caused by the terrain and old oak stumps blocking the way. The simulated map showed the pickup could easily stop at the spot where the wig fell, then reverse or make a slight turn to head back out the same way. What stood out was how clearly the model illustrated that if a struggle occurred beside the truck, a strong pull could dislodge the wig and tear part of the dress, exactly where the evidence was recovered in real life. Linda asked for one more comparison: the location of the electrical cord segment by the river that had previously been considered unrelated. When those 1957 coordinates were added, the system revealed a logical connecting route from the forest trail. The truck could exit onto the main dirt road, drive straight for a stretch, then turn down to a secluded part of the Mississippi riverbank. It was a complicated but entirely feasible route, especially for someone intimately familiar with the terrain. Taken together, the GIS model reconstructed a timeline that Reeves back then never had a chance to visualize clearly. Evelyn leaves the old neighborhood, is followed by a pickup truck, turns onto the trail. A struggle occurs, causing the wig and fabric to be left behind. Then the perpetrator exits the forest via the loop, possibly driving along the river where the cord segment appeared. Linda silently stared at the map, where the glowing dots representing the 1950s evidence now lay neatly along one logical razor-sharp travel route, as if the truth itself were stepping out of the darkness into the light. Those simulated lines didn't just revive Evelyn's final path, they also perfectly matched the behavior of someone disposing of evidence using a little-known trail, moving slowly, choosing a secluded riverbank spot to pause or discard items. The map alone could not convict anyone, but it aligned without deviation with every piece of evidence Linda now possessed. As the technician saved the final model, Linda pointed to the trail on the screen and whispered, as if speaking directly to Reeves in 1957, "You were right to suspect the truck. It was here." And with the GIS map matching the 1957 evidence locations down to the meter, Linda knew the investigation's direction had never been more certain or concrete. Immediately after the probable travel route was convincingly reconstructed using the GIS model, Sheriff Linda Carver shifted her full focus to tracking down the current whereabouts of the man who had been a person of interest in 1957, Donald Kerrigan. Nearly half a century had passed, records faded, paperwork lost, witnesses dead, but Linda knew that if there was one person who had to be checked first, it was Kerrigan. She started with the scattered notes still existing in the old file. Donald's former address on the east side of Hannibal, his occupation as a carpenter, a black Ford F-Series pickup, roughly 1953 model, and the only note of any legal value in the entire file: headlights misaligned, vehicle repaired in 1957. Most of the information was long outdated, so Linda had to dig deeper into the county's administrative archives, searching tax records from the 1960s, address changes in Missouri driver's license records, and Social Security-related filings. She sent a formal request to Jefferson City for Donald's driving license history. After nearly a week, the report came back: Donald Kerrigan had left Hannibal in 1962, moved to Springfield, a larger city more than 100 miles away, and from 1965 onward, his records remained stable at the same address on a small street in the south part of the city. That meant Donald had not only never left the state, but had lived a relatively quiet life long enough to stay off any law enforcement radar. Linda continued examining Donald's tax records decade by decade. The numbers showed steady declared income from carpentry work, no large debts or unusual financial events. Hospital records revealed a few admissions for minor work injuries and a history of high blood pressure after age 60, meaning he was still alive as of 2010. This layer of data not only gave her his current location but confirmed that Donald had never fled the state, never changed his name, never disappeared from the system, as if the man had never been running from anything. But what caught Linda's attention most was a single note she stumbled upon in a forgotten box of old paper repair invoices at the Vehicle Registration Archive. The box had been overlooked for years and contained repair tickets never entered into the modern system. On one faded ticket, in barely legible brown ink, were the words Kerrigan, Ford, F. Sir, 1953. Scratched front bumper, adjusted misaligned headlights. That note had never appeared in the copies. Reeves saw because minor repair tickets weren't forwarded to police at the time. Linda held the paper up and compared it to the witness descriptions of headlights shining downward onto the road. Though not prosecutable evidence on its own, it was a crucial piece, an overdue confirmation that Reeves's 1957 gut suspicion had been right all along. The ticket also showed the repair date as the weekend Evelyn disappeared, making Linda's body tense in a moment of compressed silence. Someone fixing their headlights at that exact time could not be dismissed. Digging further, Linda located the woodworking shop where Donald had worked in Hannibal before moving to Springfield. She interviewed the current owner, the inheritor, who revealed something interesting. Donald had left town rather abruptly, offering little explanation beyond wanting a change of scenery. That alone wasn't enough to prove guilt, but placed alongside the newly analyzed evidence, it became another faint streak, helping to form the portrait of a man who may have tried to erase traces of his past. After systematizing all the data, Linda now had a new, sharper, heavier, and far more serious file than anything Reeves ever held. Donald was still alive, living in Springfield, and had owned and repaired the exact truck that matched the 1957 statements. The GIS maps showed the trail into Mark Twain Forest could only be used by someone intimately familiar with the area. Donald, born and raised around those woods, fit perfectly. The evidence in the wooden box tied directly to Evelyn's belongings. The real hair carried the maternal DNA line. The fabric matched her clothing. The electrical cord was consistent with the murder weapon. The paper bore handwriting consistent with Donald's when he was young. Taken together, everything formed a chain of evidence that, viewed as a whole, pointed to only one name: the carpenter who had lived quietly in Springfield for the past 48 years. Linda closed the file and took a deep breath. She knew she was standing at the most critical step in a journey of more than half a century to find justice for Evelyn Brooks. Donald Kerrigan was no longer a potential suspect. He had become the name she had to confront face to face. Sheriff Linda Carver spent 3 straight nights in her office compiling every discovery into a final report tight enough to present to a Marion County judge. This was no longer the scattered notes or isolated documents of Reeves's era in 1957. She was building a complete unified case file that connected pieces dormant for 53 years into a structure with weight and the ability to withstand legal scrutiny. On her desk lay the DNA report confirming the real hair in the wooden box shared the maternal line with the Brooks family. Next to it, the fiber analysis proving the clothing belonged to Evelyn. And beside that, the electrical cord analysis showing clear strangulation marks. What had been disconnected evidence was now direct evidence, something the case had lacked for half a century. Linda cataloged every item, clearly noting the links between the 1957 evidence and the items found in 2010, emphasizing that they were discovered together in a wooden box hidden beneath a Palmyra house floor, an action that could only be intentional concealment related to the disappearance. She moved on to the circumstantial evidence section, witness statements about a dark pickup truck, descriptions of misaligned headlights, old engine noise, the GIS model proving the feasible route into Mark Twain Forest, the 1957 repair ticket noting scratched front bumper and adjusted misaligned headlights, the fact that Donald was the only person on the vehicle owner list who matched and had worked in the forest area, all arranged into a seamless chain of events. Though none of these alone could convict, together they formed a context too consistent to ignore. Beyond physical and circumstantial evidence, Linda presented the new timeline, reconstructed using GIS technology, demonstrating perfect alignment between Evelyn's movements, the locations where evidence was dropped, and Donald's ability to use a little-known trail at night. She stressed that the GIS didn't merely suggest a plausible route, it matched the 1957 discovery sites meter for meter. What Reeves could never prove was now undeniable, thanks to modern technology. Most importantly, Linda added the final critical section, handwriting analysis. though not sufficient to convict on its own. The similarity between the "I'm sorry" note in the box and samples of Donald's youthful handwriting exceeded random chance. She quoted the expert report, "High probability same writer, 70% degree of similarity." Within the overall case model, this became the spark that ignited the entire argument. Linda combined everything into a nearly 80-page final report, a document she reread until every sentence was airtight. She submitted the file to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office, along with a formal request for an arrest warrant for Donald Kerrigan on the grounds of direct physical evidence linked to the victim, circumstantial evidence establishing opportunity and means, a timeline that perfectly matched maps and data, and the handwriting link as corroboration. The county prosecutor examined each piece carefully, sometimes pausing for long moments over the sections describing the wooden box, because hiding evidence of that significance could only come from someone directly involved. After 2 hours of discussion, he nodded. "We have enough to take to the judge." The hearing took place in a quiet review room, with only 3 people present: Linda, the prosecutor, and the Marion County judge, a man who had handled hundreds of cases, but rarely seen a decades cold case with evidence connected on so many levels. He read every page, occasionally flipping back to compare maps or lab notes. When he reached the wooden box description, he set the file down and looked at Linda. "You're certain no one else could have placed that box there?" Linda answered firmly, "Impossible, Your Honor." The contents matched the 1957 evidence and everything related to Evelyn Brooks perfectly. A short silence followed before the judge signed. His pen stroke slid to the bottom of the page, the ink soaking in like the click of an old iron latch finally opening. The arrest warrant for Donald Kerrigan, the man who had vanished from the town's memory for nearly 50 years, was officially signed at 3:14 p.m. 53 years after the night Evelyn Brooks disappeared, the name Donald Kerrigan finally stepped out of the shadows of a cold case file and into the light of justice, beginning with a single signature on a quiet afternoon in Marion County. At dawn the next day, while the suburban streets were still shrouded in thick fog, a Springfield police tactical team, coordinated with 2 deputies from Marion County, quietly approached the small blue-gray house at the end of Maple Ridge Road. The house was unremarkable. Old shingles, neatly mowed lawn, closed garage. Everything so peaceful it was hard to believe the man inside was wanted for something that happened in 1957. Instead of sirens or flashing lights, they chose a soft approach to avoid drawing attention or panicking the suspect. 3 officers took the front door, 2 more covered the rear in case Donald tried to flee. When the knock came, firm but not loud, the house remained completely silent. An officer knocked again and announced clearly, "Springfield Police. We have a search warrant and an arrest warrant from Marion County Court." About 5 seconds later, slow footsteps sounded inside, then the deadbolt turned. The door opened a crack, revealing a man in his late 70s with disheveled gray hair, a wrinkled gray sweater, and tired eyes that showed no defiance. Donald Kerrigan looked at the officers for several seconds, as if trying to fit the faces in front of him into a picture he never wanted to see again. When the officer reread the arrest warrant for the 1957 disappearance of Evelyn Brooks, Donald froze, not in violent shock, but as if hearing a name he thought time had buried forever, suddenly rise up through the dust of memories he had tried to cover. He didn't ask why, and didn't protest. When told to turn around for cuffing, Donald simply sighed, raised his wrists without needing to be told twice. His shoulders sagged as though they had carried the weight of this moment for far too long. During the entire process he offered no resistance, no argument, no shouting. There was only one thing he said, spoken so softly the officer had to lean in to hear. "I knew this day would come." The team fell silent. No one replied. They walked him across the porch, where early sunlight was beginning to spill down and cast Donald's shadow onto the pavement, small and unsteady in his old sweater. As the police car pulled away from Maple Ridge, neighbors began peeking out of doors, through curtains, some stepping fully onto their lawns. They all wore the same expression, shock mixed with disbelief. To them, Donald Kerrigan was just the odd but harmless carpenter who kept to himself in his garage all day and had never bothered anyone. An elderly woman leaning in her doorway said shakily, "He's lived here 40 years. It can't be." Another man shook his head. "They've got the wrong guy. He fixed my roof just last year." But when they saw police lead him away without any struggle, the whispers started. The old Ford truck he once owned, the past no one knew about, the reason he suddenly moved to Springfield in 1962. Many realized they had never once asked Donald anything about his life before he arrived in the neighborhood. By noon, the news had spread across Springfield. A 78-year-old man arrested in connection with a 1957 disappearance case in Hannibal. People who had waved to him every morning, hired him to build bookshelves, considered him a harmless fixture of the block, now stood stunned in front of their televisions. Almost 60 years later, and they arrest him now? What could he have done to hide it that long? I saw him raking leaves in his yard just this morning. The shock rippled so widely that local reporters gathered the same day, setting up cameras in front of the little house now sealed with police tape. The peaceful Springfield community had never imagined a dark past hiding behind those old wooden walls. A past that began one night in 1957, when Evelyn Brooks vanished into the Mark Twain Forest. And only when police took Donald away did people realize a haunting truth. Sometimes the person carrying the biggest secret is the one everyone thought was the most ordinary. Donald Kerrigan was brought to the Marion County interrogation room that same afternoon. A small room with pale gray walls, an old wooden table, and a tape recorder placed in the center. His court-appointed attorney, a middle-aged man named Howard Mills, sat beside him, while Sheriff Linda Carver sat across from them, files stacked neatly in front of her. After fully reading Donald his rights, Linda began the interrogation in a calm but icy tone, starting with basic questions about his residence, occupation, and the years he lived in Hannibal before moving to Springfield. Donald answered slowly, avoiding Linda's gaze, his hands clasped together as if trying to maintain his composure. When Linda mentioned the name Evelyn Brooks, Donald froze for the first time, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that made Howard Mills glance at him warily. Donald did not deny knowing Evelyn, but kept his answers vague. "I saw her around town, but we weren't close." Linda wasted no time beating around the bush. She pulled out a photograph of the wig hair found in the wooden box in Palmyra and placed it in front of Donald. He looked at it for less than a second before turning away. Next, she laid out the pale green fabric scrap and the piece of electrical cord, now fully described in the forensic report, side by side. When Linda stated clearly that the mitochondrial DNA matched the Brooks family and the fabric matched the clothing Evelyn was wearing, Donald took a deep breath, his eyes glazing over. He still said nothing. Linda opened the GIS map folder, pointed to the trail leading into the Mark Twain Forest, and said, "This is where Evelyn went in. This is where her hair and fabric were left behind. And this," she pointed to the third arc, "is the route your vehicle could have taken based on the reconstruction model." Donald swallowed hard, his hands beginning to tremble despite his attempt to maintain a facade of calm. Linda leaned forward. "You were there, Donald. We have proof." The final piece of evidence that made the room feel as if it were sinking was the handwritten note. "I'm sorry." Linda presented a handwriting comparison from Donald's 1956 records placed next to the note, pointing out 5 exact matches. Howard Mills gently placed a hand on Donald's arm, as if warning him, if he kept hiding anything, there would be no chance left for a deal. For the first several hours, Donald clung to silence, offering only scattered, feeble denials, but each denial was met with another piece of evidence from Linda, all linking together into a chain with no gaps. Finally, around the 5th hour, Donald raised a hand to rub his wrinkled face, closed his eyes for a long time, and let out a long, exhausted breath, as if part of his elderly strength had drained away. "I gave her a ride," he said in a hoarse, choked voice. Howard Mills looked directly at him and asked clearly, "Are you voluntarily continuing?" Donald nodded, then opened his eyes and stared down at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. He began to speak, slowly at first, then gradually carried along by memories he had probably tried to bury for more than half a century. That night, he had encountered Evelyn near the old downtown area. She seemed confused and tired, and Donald had pulled over and asked if she needed a ride home. Evelyn agreed. In the car, as their conversation became more open, Evelyn said something that shocked Donald. He used that exact word. Evelyn told him she was transgender. To the Donald of 1957, a young man raised in a deeply prejudiced and bigoted social environment. This left him stunned, bewildered, and angry beyond control. He described that moment as an explosion he had never been able to extinguish his whole life. "I didn't know what I became in that moment. I just felt deceived." Donald said he demanded Evelyn get out of the car immediately, but she refused, trying to explain that she hadn't meant to deceive him. "I yelled," she yelled back, "and Donald choked up. Linda did not interrupt. She simply let the tape recorder run in the compressed silence. After several long, heavy seconds, Donald continued, his voice trembling as if forced from an old chest. "I reached for something in the car. I didn't think. I just wanted her to stop." Linda asked, "Was that the electrical cord?" Donald nodded without looking up. "I wrapped it around her neck." Howard Mills gently reminded him, "You can stop if you need to." But Donald shook his head and continued, the confession dragged out by the weight of 53 buried years. He described Evelyn struggling, trying to pull his hands away, trying to breathe, trying to get out of the car. Donald pulled the cord tighter. Then she collapsed and stopped moving. When Linda asked what he did next, Donald closed his eyes, his hands clenched so tightly they turned white. "I panicked. I drove into the trail. It was a place I knew from logging. I thought no one would ever find her." He said he dragged Evelyn's body out of the car, pulled it under the canopy of a large oak deep in the Mark Twain Forest, and hastily covered her with dirt and dry leaves. The wig hair and fabric scrap fell off while he dragged the body in. The electrical cord he had in the car was tossed aside, probably washed downriver when he continued driving. Linda asked for the exact location where he hid the body. Donald opened his eyes, staring blankly as if seeing through the interrogation room wall, then described every detail clearly: an oak tree with roots protruding like claws, a flat rock lying diagonally to the left, and about 3 meters south was a narrow trail leading down to the riverbank. He said he hadn't buried her deeply. He only covered her with dirt and leaves because it was too dark. "I came back once afterward, but the rain had washed everything away." Linda recorded the entire description, asked him to mark the location on the map, and had him sign the statement. Donald signed, his hand shaking but resolute, like a man finally releasing a burden that had weighed on his chest for more than half his life. When the tape recorder was turned off, no one in the room said another word, not because there was nothing left to say, but because all three understood that silence was the sound of a 53-year chapter finally closing, along with the crushing confession of a man who had finally faced a truth he once thought he could bury forever. The very next day after Donald Kerrigan revealed the disposal site, Sheriff Linda Carver mobilized the forensic team, geological survey specialists, and a group of investigators experienced in forest crime scenes to enter the Mark Twain area using the exact coordinates Donald had described. It was early winter, leaves had fallen heavily, the ground had hardened from the cold, but was still moist enough to preserve subsurface disturbances. The forensic team brought a ground-penetrating radar, GPR unit equipment that uses radar waves to detect structural changes beneath the soil, especially useful for old burial sites invisible to the naked eye. As the group moved deeper into the forest along the trail reconstructed via GIS, Linda never took her eyes off the map Donald had hand-marked in the interrogation room. She walked beside the GPR technician, listening to each intermittent beep whenever the subsurface showed unusual voids. Near a large oak with roots twisting upward like gnarled arms, just as Donald had described, the GPR began displaying an abnormal convex arc at a depth of about 40 to 50 centimeters. The radar screen showed a disruption in the soil structure, an unnatural depression that had been filled in. The GPR technician stopped, placed markers around the area, and sketched a small map to confirm this was the spot to dig. Linda signaled to begin excavation. The forensic team used small, light tools, scraping away layers of soil, avoiding large shovels to prevent destroying evidence. Within minutes of removing the surface layer, the smell of cold, damp earth mixed with the odor of long-decayed organic matter rose up. One technician let out a quiet exclamation upon seeing a pale green fabric thread emerge from the corner of the soil, stuck to a darker patch. When lifted with tweezers, the thread clearly matched the previously analyzed sample from Evelyn. Soon after, they uncovered a larger piece of fabric, possibly part of a dress. Though almost completely rotted, the faint remaining pattern matched the description of the dress Evelyn's best friend had once given. Next, the team found a small corroded metal piece resembling a bracket from the undercarriage of an older truck. When compared on-site with illustrations of 1953 Ford F-100 parts, the technician confirmed an exact match in size and mounting position. This further corroborated Donald's statement. While dragging Evelyn's body into the woods, his truck may have slipped slightly on the uneven ground, causing the undercarriage to scrape a rock, dislodging the metal piece, and creating the front bumper scratch noted on the 1957 repair invoice. Digging a few more centimeters deeper, they found no intact remains. More than half a century had erased nearly everything. But small bone fragments appeared scattered within the old grave's perimeter, some consistent with ribs, others the size of finger bones. Though difficult to analyze fully, these fragments were sufficient to confirm this was the site where Evelyn's body had once been placed and covered, exactly as Donald confessed. After collecting everything, the forensic team sealed the evidence, documented the scene, and transported it all to the central lab for trial preparation. Within 2 weeks, the case file was complete, including Donald Kerrigan's recorded confession, forensic evidence matching Evelyn Brooks' strangulation marks on the electrical cord, terrain evidence matching the 1957 route, bone and clothing fragments from the grave, and the 1957 repair invoice. Everything formed an irreversible logical chain. Donald Kerrigan's trial was held publicly at the Marion County Courthouse at the end of 2010. The courtroom was packed. Brooks' family members, Hannibal residents, reporters from Springfield and St. Louis. All came to witness a cold case solved after more than half a century. On the defendant's stand, Donald looked small and frail, his shoulders slumped as if unable to bear both the psychological weight and the mountain of evidence closing in around him. The prosecution presented the case in 3 layers: the confession, newly excavated physical evidence, and modern forensic proof. First, they played the recording of Donald admitting he gave Evelyn a ride, flew into a rage upon learning she was transgender, strangled her with the electrical cord, and took her body into the Mark Twain Forest. His voice was trembling but clear, sounding like a soul worn away by time finally forced to speak the truth after years of running. Next, the prosecutor displayed the physical evidence: the hair with mitochondrial DNA, the fabric from Evelyn's dress, the cord with strangulation marks, the I'm sorry note, and most crucially, the items excavated from the grave. They showed photos of the Mark Twain Forest scene, the GPR scan detecting the burial site, the metal piece matching an F-100, and the remaining bone fragments. Each item was another dagger driven into the story. This was no longer a vague missing person case. It was a meticulously concealed murder now dragged into the light. Finally, the prosecution presented the GIS model reconstructing the timeline, showing how Donald's truck entered the trail and perfectly matched the evidence locations. The defense tried to argue that Donald's memory might be confused due to old age and that the evidence could have been affected by decades underground, but these arguments crumbled against the airtight scientific chain. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell dead silent, as if the entire space was holding its breath. After more than 4 hours, the door opened, and the 4 persons stepped forward to read the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. No one in the room was surprised. most felt only a mix of relief and lingering darkness. Donald Kerrigan stood motionless, no reaction, eyes fixed on the floor. The judge sentenced him to 25 years, the maximum possible given the crime's era and the defendant's age. When the gavel struck the wooden bench, the sentence sealed the end of a 53-year quest for answers. Donald Kerrigan was led away in silence. No one saw him cry, but some said that as he passed through the courtroom door, his old shoulders shook, as if he had finally let go of something that had haunted him his entire life. And that thing had dragged unimaginable pain behind it for a girl who never lived to see 17. Once the sentence against Donald Kerrigan was pronounced and the final legal file was signed and closed, Sheriff Linda Carver allowed herself to look back at the entire journey. Marion County had traveled over more than half a century, a journey full of the era's limitations, unintentional mistakes, and scientific advances that Sheriff Allen Reeves in 1957 could never have imagined. She spent weeks compiling the final investigative report, clearly analyzing why the original investigation failed and why 2010 succeeded in cracking a case that seemed forever buried. First were the technical issues. In 1957, local police had no forensic tools for DNA analysis, no digital crime scene reconstruction, no sophisticated evidence storage systems, and especially no subsurface survey equipment like GPR. When Reeves found the wig hair, fabric, and electrical cord, he did everything he could to understand them, but there was no way at the time to confirm they belonged to Evelyn or were linked to violence. Everything stayed at possible, while the law required concrete proof. Additionally, heavy rains in the days after Evelyn disappeared washed away all traces in the Mark Twain Forest, preventing Reeves from following footprints, drag marks, or any signs of a struggle. Without a body and no clear endpoint to the timeline, the case became nearly impossible to advance under the primitive investigative conditions of that era. In contrast, 2010 brought tools Reeves never had: mitochondrial DNA analysis that confirmed the origin of Evelyn's real hair from strands thought long decayed, synthetic fiber and dye analysis that proved the 53-year-old fabric belonged to her clothing, deformation analysis of the electrical cord proving strangulation marks, software-based handwriting comparison that identified matches between the "I'm sorry" note and young Donald's writing. GPR allowed them to see through the earth without digging and locate the old grave where the radar showed altered soil structure. And finally, GIS, something 21st century investigators take for granted, became the key to reconstructing Evelyn's final route and proving the trail Donald used to dispose of the body. Linda wrote clearly in the report, "If in 1957 police were lost in the darkness of a forest, in 2010 we walk through that same forest illuminated by science." She also emphasized that Reeves, despite every limitation of his time, had followed the right instincts. He circled the correct area, noted the right trail, and listed Donald as a person of interest. He simply lacked the tools to take the case further. When the file was returned to storage, this time with a large note, "Closed. Solved 2010." Linda stood for a long time in front of the wooden shelf where Evelyn's box had sat silently for 53 years. The case had a conclusion, but its timeline still sent chills down her spine. The truth had been there from the beginning, buried under dirt, locked in a wooden box, hidden beneath distorted witness memories, obscured by the limitations of early investigative procedures. But it never disappeared. It was only delayed. In her final report to the county prosecutor's office, Linda ended with a sentence she believed Reeves, if he were still alive, would have said, "The truth is never lost. It only sleeps inside old case files." In the story of Evelyn Brooks's case, what haunts most is not just the death, but the fact that the truth was buried for 53 years, a span long enough for an entire generation to grow up and forget. Yet the persistence, scientific progress, and unwavering determination of investigators like Sheriff Linda Carver brought justice back. This mirrors modern life in the United States. We still live in a society with many unsolved cases and many victims from vulnerable communities, especially transgender people, young women, and minorities, who are often overlooked or do not receive the attention they deserve in the critical early hours and days of an investigation. In this story, Evelyn tried to live authentically as her true gender, and her death stemmed in part from bigotry and another person's irrational fear. It is a warning that prejudice does not only cause emotional harm, sometimes it pushes people into life-threatening situations. The United States today still sees far too many acts of violence against transgender individuals, especially transgender women of color, a reality that law enforcement and the community cannot ignore. On the other hand, the case also shows the vital importance of scientific progress and investment in forensic tools like DNA, GPR, and handwriting analysis. Without those technologies, Evelyn's voice would have remained forever buried beneath the soil of the Mark Twain Forest. The real lesson is, the truth always finds a way back, but society has a duty to ensure it doesn't have to wait another half-century. If you see something wrong, whether in your neighborhood, your community, or your own family, speak up, preserve information, protect the vulnerable. Justice does not come on its own. It requires collective will and persistence, just as Linda Carver never gave up. Ultimately, the story reminds us that every victim deserves to be remembered, every story deserves to be heard, and the truth, no matter how long it is hidden, always deserves to be brought back into the light. Thank you for joining us on this journey to uncover the truth after 53 years of silence in the Evelyn Brooks case. If you found value in it, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next real investigative stories. See you in the next video, where we'll continue awakening mysteries from the cold case files.